Have you ever done something so incredibly dumb as a kid that you actually feared you might not make it home? Well, what started as a simple Saturday night prank for my friends and me ended up becoming a terrifying nightmare that I'll never forget. Welcome back to 3 True Scary Horror Stories, and hit that subscribe button if you're new here so you don't miss out on more. Also, if you're enjoying the story so far, smash that like button to help us out. Back when my friends and I were 13, we were total troublemakers looking for any kind of thrill. About 10 years ago, we all lived on the same suburban block, but the neighborhood looked a lot different back then. There were way fewer houses and a lot more thick, dark patches of woods separating the properties. For the sake of this story, I'll call my friends Mark, James, and Matt. Usually, Mark or James were the brave ones who would actually walk up to the front porches to ring the bells. Matt and I were the designated hiders, finding a spot in the shadows the second the bell rang. That night, we had already hit about 5 or 6 different houses. Most of the time, the reactions were exactly what you'd expect. A guy would open the door, step out onto the stoop, maybe yell a few choice words into the darkness, and then head back inside. But here's the crazy part. We were about to pick the absolute wrong house to mess with, and things were about to take a very dark turn. At a couple of those earlier houses, we were feeling bold and rang the bell a second time just to get a bigger reaction. One guy got so fed up he yelled that he was calling the cops, so as soon as he slammed his door, we all bolted down the street to the next block over. On that block, the woods were even denser, and the houses looked a lot more unkempt and lonely. The very first house we saw was right across the street from a thick patch of trees, making it the perfect hiding spot for us. The place looked completely run down, with overgrown tall grass and a ratty old car sitting in the driveway under a dusty cover. It was a small, depressing-looking house. Mark decided he was going to hit this one, so he snuck up to the door. He barely had enough time to make it back across the street before the front door swung wide open. If you're finding this story creepy so far, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this mystery. A man stepped out onto the porch, and he was massive, at least 6 feet tall and built like a tank. Unlike the other neighbors we had bothered, this man was instantly furious. He didn't just look around. He started pacing all over his front yard, checking behind every single bush and shouting threats into the dark. We were all huddled together in the woods, laughing quietly like we always did, thinking it was just another funny reaction. Eventually, the guy gave up and went back inside, slamming the door behind him. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, things started to feel a lot more dangerous. Mark waited for a few minutes, checked the windows to make sure the coast was clear, and then ran back up the steps to ring the bell a second time. I really didn't envy him. I wouldn't have been brave enough to mess with a guy that big again. Mark knew he didn't have much time, so after he hit the button, he sprinted to the side of the house and disappeared out of sight. The door opened even faster this time, but the man wasn't empty-handed anymore. He stepped out onto the porch holding a rifle. We all looked at each other in the woods and whispered, "Oh, shit," at the exact same time. The man checked all the same spots he had looked before, but then he started searching even harder, looking behind his car and peering into the shadows of the trees. Then, he walked out to the very center of his lawn and just stood there, completely still, as if he were thinking. He scanned the area slowly, and suddenly, his head stopped moving. He was staring directly at us in the woods. Matt, James, and I all ducked as low as we possibly could, holding our breath and hoping he hadn't seen our silhouettes in the dark. After about 10 seconds of him staring straight at our hiding spot, the man finally turned around and went back into his house. But he didn't just go back to bed. A moment later, we saw him appear at the front window. He was standing there like a statue, just watching the woods where we were hiding. We saw Mark starting to creep back toward the man's front door for a third time, but there was nothing we could do. We were way too terrified to move or even whisper a warning to him. Mark rang the bell one last time and bolted into the shadows. The man at the window didn't move at all for another full minute. Then, he slowly turned and walked away into the darkness of the house. We didn't see Mark again after that, and we were still too nervous to move an inch. Suddenly, Mark's voice ripped through the air from across the street, screaming at us to run. We didn't understand why he was yelling at first, but then we heard the heavy sound of someone sprinting up fast behind us. When we turned our heads, our hearts absolutely dropped. It was the man from across the street, and he was holding a rifle, pointing it directly at us. We ran like terrified prey trying to escape a predator, heading straight for Mark, who was waiting for us on the other side. We didn't stop running for blocks until we were absolutely sure we had lost him. Mark later explained that he started yelling the moment he saw the man sneaking across the street and into a patch of trees with his gun. We never actually reported him or told the police what happened that night. We just told a few of our close friends, and that was the end of it. Luckily, that house was many blocks away from where we lived, so we never really had to walk past it ever again. If this story is giving you the chills so far, smash that like button and tell me what you would have done in the comments. But here is where the story takes a turn you won't expect. A little while later, I moved into a house that turned out to be a total nightmare. At the time, I was a college student, and my parents were actually paying for the place. I know, I was pretty spoiled, and I definitely appreciated it. The house was modest, nothing huge or fancy, and I was actually really happy with it at first. Well, that feeling lasted for about 3 days. Then, things started getting very strange, very fast. It was a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, so I was just hanging out watching TV for a few hours. That's when I heard a distinct scraping sound on my living room floor. I looked all around the room, thinking maybe a small animal or a squirrel had somehow snuck into the house. I didn't see anything at all, so I eventually sat back down and went back to my show. That was the very first weird thing that happened. Now, this is where it gets even more unsettling. The rain kept coming down for the rest of the day and into the night, which gave me a perfect excuse to just stay inside. I stayed in the living room, watching more TV and trying to relax. I suddenly perked up when I thought I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. This sounds ridiculous now, but I actually grabbed a pillow to use as a weapon and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There, right in the middle of the dark kitchen, was a box of Cheerios sitting on the floor. Hundreds of those little cereal pieces were spilled everywhere. I had no idea how that could have possibly happened or why the box was there. I dropped my pillow and started cleaning up the mess, but as I was kneeling there, I heard a loud creak. It was that specific sound a wooden floor makes when someone steps on a weak spot. It came from right by the kitchen table. I looked up fast, but nobody was there. I felt like I was losing my mind, and I figured every little noise was just making me paranoid. I finished cleaning up and went back to the TV. Before we continue, make sure to hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss what happens when I finally check the attic. You won't believe what I woke up to next. The thunder outside was getting louder as the main part of the storm passed over the house, but I actually found the sound pretty relaxing. That's the last thing I remember, just enjoying the sound of the rain before I drifted off into an hour-long nap. The TV was still buzzing when I woke up, but that isn't what startled me. I'm pretty sure I woke up because of a loud bang or a heavy thud coming from downstairs. I was too tired to care at that point, so I just turned off the TV and marched upstairs to go to bed. The next day was totally normal, and the day after that was fine too. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that the weirdness started up again. Now this is where things took a turn for the worse. I woke up in my bed that morning feeling absolutely terrible, like I had been out partying and drinking all night, even though I hadn't touched a drop. I felt sicker than I had ever felt with a real hangover. I didn't move around much that day because I felt so weak. The dark, gloomy weather just made me want to stay in bed even more. I kept the TV on in my room all day just for some background noise, and I kept a trash can right by the bed in case I had to throw up. Around midday, I muted the TV because I heard a series of sounds coming from right above me. It was coming from the attic. The entrance to the attic was actually inside my bedroom, and most of the attic space was built directly over my head. It wasn't just one single thud either. I heard 3 or 4 of them in a row. Even though I felt like I was going to puke every time I moved, I managed to drag myself out of bed to investigate. Which part of this would have made you move out immediately? Drop it in the comments and let me know. I reached up and grabbed the string to the attic door, pulling it down with a shaky hand. I didn't go up there empty-handed, though. I brought one of my old baseball bats just in case there was something hiding in the shadows. As I climbed those steps, I reached for the light switch and flicked it on, hoping to finally see what was making all that noise. But there wasn't much to see. It was just some old boxes left by the previous owners scattered around the floor. There were no animals, no intruders, and nothing that looked like it could make a sound. I didn't stay long because that attic really creeped me out, so I scrambled back down as fast as I could. If you're enjoying this story so far, definitely smash that like button for me. Everything stayed quiet until later that night. I was still feeling pretty sick when a sudden noise jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was just a loud clap of thunder from a storm outside, but then I heard it again, that same heavy, familiar thud coming from the attic right above my head. It sent a literal chill down my spine. I pulled the attic door down one more time, grabbed my bat, and went back up those stairs. I tried to sound as tough as possible and let out a loud, intimidating shout to scare whoever was up there. But before my hand even touched the light switch, a sound cut through the darkness that stopped my heart. It was the sound of a little child giggling. Just a soft, playful laugh coming from the pitch-black room. But here is the crazy part. You know that feeling when your stomach just drops and you feel completely weightless from pure terror? That doesn't even begin to describe how I felt in that moment. Fear is way too small of a word for what I was going through. I didn't just walk out of that house. I vanished. I don't even remember the act of running, just that I was suddenly outside in the freezing rain calling my dad to come get me. I was a total mess, crying and trying to explain everything the best I could. My parents could see how emotional I was, and I think they actually believed me. The very next day, they helped me pack every single thing I owned, and I moved right back home. To this day, I'm still convinced that what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. Now, this is where it gets interesting. A few years later, when I was 20, I took a job working as a maid for an elderly woman for a couple of weeks. Her name was Mel, and she lived in a massive, ancient house on a piece of land that would have been stunning if anyone had actually taken care of it. It was about 2 acres of property, mostly surrounded by thick, dark woods on 3 sides, with just the main road out front. The house itself was mostly made of wood and was incredibly dark on the inside. Mel kept the blinds shut in almost every room for reasons I never understood. I'd try to be helpful and open them up to let some sunlight in, but every time I walked back into a room, she had already closed them again. Before we get into the really unsettling things that happened at Mel's, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. It helps out the channel a lot. Anyway, the whole atmosphere of that place was just heavy. She used candles to light some of the rooms instead of lamps, which made the whole place feel prehistoric. And of course, the floors were made of old wood that creaked like crazy everywhere you stepped. Mel was about 70 years old, and she mostly needed me for the physical chores she couldn't handle anymore. I spent my days sweeping, dusting, washing dishes, doing laundry, and sorting through her mail. One weekend, Mel asked if I could stay over for a night or two. The house had 4 bedrooms and she lived all by herself, so space wasn't an issue for me. Have you ever worked a job that gave you bad vibes? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, this all happened over a Friday and technically a Saturday as well. I arrived on Friday morning and didn't say much to Mel, since she wasn't a big talker. I went to the bedroom I was assigned and tossed my bag onto the bed. When I turned around to head back out, Mel was standing right in the doorway. She had a really unsettling way about her, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't even say hello. She just instructed me to start cleaning that bedroom immediately. After that, she told me to tidy up the house, and then she went upstairs. I didn't see her again that day, but I could definitely hear her. She was walking back and forth in her bedroom directly above me for hours. It was so strange to hear those footsteps never stopping. Wait until you hear what she was hiding in that house, because things were about to go from weird to absolutely terrifying. There were no TVs anywhere in the building, so I had no clue what she could have been doing with all her time. One thing that struck me as really bizarre was how incredibly protective she was of her basement. She made it very clear that the area was completely off limits, and she definitely didn't want me going down there for any reason. If you're already getting a bad vibe from this, smash that like button so I know you're following along. When nighttime finally came, I decided to head to bed early. This was back before smartphones were a thing, so I didn't even have a way to check the exact time. I'm guessing it was probably 9 or 10 o'clock at night. For the first few hours, everything was actually pretty peaceful. However, I still had a really hard time falling asleep, mostly because it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever laid in. It felt like I'd been tossing and turning for hours when I suddenly started hearing footsteps right outside my room on the creaky floorboards. It sounded like Mel was walking past my room at an incredibly slow pace. I tried to tell myself that maybe she was just heading to the bathroom in the middle of the night. But here's the crazy part. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but this time she stopped right outside my door. I sat up in the dark and just listened. I could hear the wood creaking from the pressure of Mel standing there, and it was honestly starting to creep me out. Eventually, she walked away. I heard her head down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from the first floor. I had a strong gut feeling it was the basement door. If you want to see what happens next in stories like this, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. It was a good while later that I heard the door open and close again, followed by heavy, slow footsteps coming back up those creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came right to my door and then just stopped. I sat up one more time to listen, and I could hear the floorboards groaning under her weight outside the door. And then I heard the doorknob slowly start to turn. I panicked and laid back down, pulling the sheets over my head to pretend I was fast asleep. I heard Mel take a few cautious steps into the room, pause for a moment, and then leave. She went back to her own room and shut the door. I was more than a bit disturbed by this. It was just such bizarre behavior. I waited about half an hour in the dark before deciding I absolutely had to see what was in that basement. I got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to the door, and then made my way down the stairs as quietly as I possibly could. Now this is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, pretty disgusting. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and crept down the steps. When I reached the bottom step, I had to fight the urge to scream out loud. There were 2 old wooden chairs sitting right in the center of the basement, and inside them were 2 things I can only describe as decaying corpses with wigs on their heads. The sight of a bug crawling across one of them made me want to puke even more than I already did. I forced myself to walk deeper into the basement, getting closer to the corpses because I had to make sure they were actually real. Both of the bodies had men's wigs placed on them. The bigger one of the two was even wearing a beret. I don't know much about dead bodies or how fast they rot, but I'd guess these corpses were both at least a year old. My heart felt like it stopped for a second when I heard footsteps coming from the floor above me. I knew I couldn't make it back to the light switch in time. I had no choice but to hide behind one of the old couches in the basement as I heard those slow, heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, one creaky step at a time. I kept my hands clamped over my mouth as I heard Mel reach the final stair. Then, I heard her whisper my name in the quiet room. For a split second, I looked around the edge of the couch and saw Mel already halfway across the basement with a huge kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me if I moved fast, so I jumped up and ran for the stairs. She screamed my name and started chasing after me as fast as she could. When I finally made it to the first floor of the house, I sprinted upstairs to the bedroom where I'd been sleeping to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back down the stairs, Mel was already standing at the top of the basement steps. I didn't stop for anything. I just ran straight out the front door and dove into my car. Which part of that basement discovery surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments and let me know what you would have done. I cranked the engine, finally caught my breath, and looked back at the front door of that massive house. Mel was just standing there, watching me leave. I sped off the property and down the road, not stopping until I got home 10 minutes later. Now, here is the lucky part. I never gave her my phone number or address, so she could never find me again. If I had to guess, one of those bodies belonged to the dead husband she mentioned to me twice. But as for that smaller one, I still have no clue who that was. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and share it. Seeing those bodies was a nightmare, and I just know that something was deeply wrong with that woman.